For joining today. We're going to get started. We're really excited for this series. It's the first in our series for MVP on emotional health. And so we know that mental health, emotional health are really key parts of our programming model. And for this month, we've taken the month of April to bring some experts and professional to both our members and all of our different audiences across MVP to lead up to the month of May, which most people know is Mental Health Awareness Month. So inside our work at MVP, we're seeing a lot of impact on COVID-19 and what is happening within our own population, both on the player side and the veteran side. We're seeing, everything from Olympic athletes kind of going through some challenges, seeing the Olympics getting canceled, right? And then we're also seeing the veteran population being forced into social isolation, which many folks are all too familiar with. And so well, prior to this crisis, the National Health Institute states that about 1 in 5 Americans already have a precondition to mental health problems, and that's everything from depression and anxiety. And in a recent episode from the Patriot Act by the comedian Hassan Minhaj on the state of mental health in America, he discussed that there's even a lack of systems to support for mental health in America, where even in some small towns, the nearest therapist is 6 hours away. So even before this crisis, we already had a mental health challenge. And so what we're seeing nationally is an exacerbation of that. And most recently, especially in our work at MVP, these mental health challenges are already a risk. And what we saw from one of our partners this last year from the Bob Woodger Foundation is they released a report on the impact of veterans for COVID-19. And it's pretty obvious, saying that many veterans have already experienced social isolation, and with COVID-19, it's likely to exacerbate this problem. So we brought together some experts today that we're really excited to share with, and they're going to talk a little bit about mental health in America, the COVID-19 crisis, and how some of our experts' methods, when we convene them together, can be helpful in the practice you guys are all setting, both MVP members and outside, on emotional regulation, especially during this time during COVID-19, where it's so crucial that we develop these things. I do need to mention our social media because my marketing manager would kill me, AJ. And so, during or after this panel, if you feel compelled to share anything you've learned, please use the hashtag MVP Connection, hashtag MVP Connection. We also have a few from our panelists, Tony and Marcus. One is hashtag no fear, hashtag the gift of adversity, and hashtag the adversity is a gift. We'll be sharing those throughout the time to make sure that you guys do that. I will, and I have to mention, in order for our resources to continue through the COVID crisis, we do have and are accepting donations. We've expanded our services through MVP extensively, and we continue to make sure that our members stay connected and feel supported during this time of need. On the second side, not only donations, but also just signing up and spreading the word about what we're doing throughout the US. And so you can do that either our website at vetsandplayers.org, which I'll show that slide here towards the end, or you can even sign up by texting Vets and Players, all capitals, no space, to 31996. And so thanks so much. We'll get started now on our panel, but before we start, I'd like everyone to get a sense of who they are. So I'll start. I'm Jacob Toops. I'm the Executive Director of MVP, based here in Los Angeles. I'll also give a quick few sentences about MVP because we'll get much into it as we kind of go and it interweaves. At the most basic level, MVP is a support program founded by Jay Glazier and Nate Boyer for combat veterans and former professional athletes in Los Angeles, Vegas, Chicago, New York, and Atlanta. We utilize the unique combination of physical activity and social connectedness to make members feel like part of a team again. And our mission is to match up combat vets and former athletes together after the uniform comes off, to give them a team to tackle the transition together. And MVP shows them that they are not alone. So with that, I'd love to introduce our 3 panelists, and they'll introduce themselves, starting with Marcus. So Marcus, kick us off.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for having me, JC. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for the intro, Jacob. And it's an honor to be on a panel with JC and Tony Blair, both tremendous men. Have the utmost respect for them in this mission for MVP. My name is Marcus Aurelius Anderson, TEDx speaker, keynote speaker, best-selling author of the book, The Gift of Adversity. I was in the military. I was an infantryman for 10th Mountain. And that was kind of when I started to learn about what adversity was and the gift of what it was. I've been doing martial arts since I was 11, continue to do it now. Love the philosophy, how it's kind of baked into that. But I'm familiar with Zen, Buddhism, Taoism, stoicism, any kind of functional pragmatic philosophy in my mind. As we talked about before, Jacob, and the notes, for me, I started understanding the gift of adversity, as I call it, whenever I was injured. I was preparing to deploy with the infantry in 2012, and I suffered a severe spinal injury that left me paralyzed from the neck down. So on my 40th birthday, when most people are thinking about their life, their family, their kids, their mortgage, their home, their 401k, and this incredible career, I wake up in a hospital bed, broke, divorced, bedridden, and paralyzed, trying to figure out, what do I do now? And how am I supposed to move on? I went from being this high functioning soldier to a person who couldn't even take care of myself. And kind of like what people are feeling right now at this point with COVID, I went through a lot of depression, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, trying to figure out what to do. And that was my lowest point. I was at a point where we're talking about mental health. I was literally suicidal, but I couldn't even act on it because of my physicality.
Cool. Thanks, Marcus, so much for that. Appreciate it. We'll go now to Tony and a little bit of introduction. Tony, kick us off.
I don't want to follow that. it was I'm still ruminating on that, man. What an amazing story. If you haven't listened to Marcus's talk, Gift of Adversity, on TEDx, you got to check it out, and his book and his stuff. I actually, a couple of years ago, I had JC at my combatives camp, talking to everyone there, and Marcus was actually slated this year. And if someone could find a cure for the virus and lift the ban within the next couple of days, that'd be great. I appreciate that. Work on that, because he'll be the guest speaker at this year's camp. So my story, my background, the kind of Reader's Digest, same thing, martial arts my whole life. I'm turning 60 in May, and I've been studying, teaching, and training for over 40 years, 50 years actually. But my whole thing was, I grew up afraid of everything, every sport. I didn't enjoy it. I was a very good athlete. I could get at anything, but I was afraid of my shadow, literally. I mean, I competed wrestling, gymnastics, martial arts, terrified all the time, but you would never know. And so I realized, like, my external facade was this macho athlete, but internally I was like scared to death, scared of winning, scared of losing, sabotaged a lot of success. Didn't sabotage by not showing up. I just never felt like I was winning. And in the 80s, through something I may, if we have time, I'll get into after, but I developed an approach to scenario-based training, and this really kind of got a lot of traction. And every month for over 10 years, we would do these force-on-4 scenarios with all these different combat athletes and martial artists and street fighters, and nobody ever pulled off the moves they thought or predicted they were going to do, because I intuitively created this interesting scenario. And it hit me, and this is just complete intuition, guys, that the single most important factor in anyone's performance wasn't their style, wasn't their technique, wasn't their experience, wasn't their gender. It was uniquely their relationship with fear. And that led me on a path. Now, here we are 30 years later, and I've got a program on how we can change our relationship with fear. When we do that, we change our life.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it. We'll get more into Tony's work a little bit later. And the third panelist we have today is JC, who's our newest member of our MVP team and our national director for emerging vets and players. So JC, give us a little bit of bio on yourself.
So yeah, first of all, let me say that I am absolutely honored and humbled to be on the same panel with two heroes of mine, one who made me a better warrior when I was fighting, and one who makes me a better man as I put up that fight and look at new ones. I did 20 years in the military. I served mostly in the Ranger Regiment and in a Special Missions Unit. I did 11 combat tours, and I like to tell people who understand, I didn't really truly know how to fight until my 6th one, and that was after I was taught by Tony. I was fighting with a very good unit. I did all my deployments either with the regiment or with or with the Special Missions Unit. I really didn't understand how to fight until my 6th deployment, where it was after I had learned from Tony. I've been out, it'll be 5 years in May. I'll have retired. My last job was, I went from being a battalion commander to running the Army School for Fitness, the Army School for Leadership, and the Army School for Resiliency. I finished up, was able to write 2 books. One about how to prepare people for the unknown, which I think is very apropos right now. And the other one more of a philosophy book on how warriors might look at the world, and how you can take that warrior philosophy and bring that to everyone, because I believe everybody can be a warrior or have that warrior mindset. So I've done a lot of work. Most of my ideas come from a background with Tony. And then Marcus has further kind of challenged and helped me develop kind of the Zen Buddhist side of kind of the way I try to help people and coach them and make them better. So, and it's both of them have tremendous impact on kind of my work.
Great. Thanks, JC. So we'll get into it. And then Marcus, I'd love to start with you first. So you've done podcasts and TED Talks and even written like a bestseller book on adversity. And for those who need a refresher, adversity is a difficulty or a misfortune. I think so we're all kind of experiencing something like that right now, especially with COVID-19. So tell us, how did you come to understand that adversity is a gift?
That's the thing. You can read all the philosophy in the world that you want. You can take all the classes that you want, but it's really difficult to truly understand if it's going to work for you until you're actually under it, until you're actually in the heat of adversity. For me, what happened was being paralyzed from the neck down, being told I'll never walk again, really forced me to stop and take a good hard look at my life and reevaluate. When you're in a bed, you can't move. The amount of money that you make, the kind of car you drive, the kind of clothes you wear do not matter. It makes you understand that, okay, the things that society values are truly not without much worth. They're not worth much. So you have to understand what is valuable to you. And frankly, right now in everybody's life, because everything has been kind of put on hold, this is an excellent opportunity for you to look at it and see what's important to you, what are truly priorities, what should you be working on, et cetera. For me, I found the gift in adversity because it pushed me to ask those questions. It forced me to strip away all the other stuff that wasn't important in my life and to genuinely focus on what was important. I tried to resist a lot of the adversity from my paralysis, but once I started actually going with it and turning into it and seeing the opportunity within it, that's when I actually was able to start recovering a few months after that, when I started seeing true gratitude. And not like the BS gratitude that everybody talks about, but like genuine gratitude where you're grateful for the bad stuff. You're grateful for the hard times. You're grateful for the person who cuts you off in traffic. You're grateful because your life is difficult. And that's where we start to really do the work. And most of the things that we're looking for in our lives are going to be held within an adversity that we're trying to avoid. And that's why it's so important to see it as an opportunity.
Thanks, Marcus. And what lessons has adversity taught you?
There's so many of them, but the ones that are going to help the most people right now is to understand that one, no matter what happens, adversity is an inevitability. If you look throughout the 20th century into just the United States, at the beginning of the century, we had a bank crisis, then we had World War I, then we had the Depression, then we had World War II, and then you had Spanish influenza throughout there, then you had Vietnam, you had Korean War, you had the housing crisis, you had all these things that have happened. And if you look at it, about every 10 years, something big happens. Whether it be something financial, whether it be some sort of pandemic, whether it be some political upheaval or a war, that's just an inevitability. And when you see it like that, you start to understand this is something that I should start preparing myself for so I don't get caught by it sideways, so I don't get ambushed by it. And then frankly, adversity is the thing that pushes us. Adversity is a natural law, and like the law of gravity, doesn't really care about your opinion if you're trying to lift something heavy, because if you can't handle the weight, then that's not adversity's problem. Adversity shows up unannounced at the most inopportune time without apology. It couldn't care less about what you want. It doesn't give a damn about your feelings. And adversity doesn't take no for an answer. Adversity forces you to drop everything else you're doing to give it your full undivided attention. And that's why it's so important, because right now, this is sort of a wake-up call for a lot of people, whether it be financially, spiritually, emotionally, something to do with their family, whatever the case may be. And the thing about adversity is it forces us to get stronger. It's like resistance training. The reason why it's called resistance training is because you are learning to resist. You are training yourself to get stronger from that. And without something to push us, the reality is we are only as strong as the adversity that we overcome. So that's the way that we have to look at this. And that's the way I try to frame it for everybody that I work with, from, multi-million-dollar companies to professional fighters to a person who's just trying to have a better relationship with their spouse.
Yeah, I love this, Mark, this notion of like that adversity challenges you, right, to become better. And we look at this as like a silver lining opportunity, many folks, to see who do we want to be during this crisis, right? Who do you want to be known as? Do you want to be known as the person who is like overcoming this adversity and learning from it? Or do you want to be the person who's kind of shift a little bit into the fear and the panic side, which Tony will talk about a little bit later. So through the work, Marcus, that you developed, you actually developed two amazing models for people to understand adversity. The first one is the adversity perception cycle, which I'm going to throw up here in a second, and the adversity scale. So can you tell us a little bit about how you how you developed these models, and a little bit about them and how people can use them in their own lives? And so let me share this really quickly with the folks here. And I'll pull up the first, which is your perception cycle.
And you've touched on a good point. The reality is that right now, the way that we decide to conduct ourselves in the heat of this hardship right now dictates how the rest of our lives are going to be. And if we're able to maintain grace under pressure right now, that's going to help us in any other situation that we're in. But if we decide to compromise, and if we allow that compromise to become permanent, that will bleed over into everything else that we're doing. So the perception cycle, if you look at anything, if you look at Viktor Frankl, if you look at Stoicism, Zen, Buddhism, Taoism, in my opinion, any functional philosophy, Buddha, anything like that, they have this, and it's a cognitive reframe. The very famous one for Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, there is a gap. And within that gap lies our freedom to decide what this means to us. So basically, everything that happens to us in our lives is neutral until we decide to give it meaning. So what happens is there is an adversity that we run into, and then we have to decide, what does this mean? Does this mean something difficult, or does this mean this is an opportunity? So the meaning that we give whatever the event is evokes an emotion. And that emotion leads to thoughts, which may potentially lead to behaviors. So that's what we're doing here. We're looking at the very first part. When adversity enters, if you look at it at the very top, that's whenever you think that it's something that's hardship. You think of it as a difficulty. This leads to disempowerment that leads forward into victimhood. It makes you weak. It's disempowering. It makes you afraid, which means that now whenever you see adversity again, it reinforces this loop that it's a hardship. And the reason why human beings have loops is because we want to be efficient. We don't want to have to continue to learn something over and over again. And that's why they're so difficult. So again, the neurology says what wires together fires together. So it's important to be able to reframe this as best we can. But if you're able to take adversity and you see it as opportunity, which is the bottom one, now you're able to shift that. Now you say, this is an opportunity. This makes me feel empowered. This emboldens my actions. This strengthens me. This actually gives me the opportunity to find gratitude and say, I'm actually grateful for this, because if it wasn't for this hardship, I would never elevate to the level to be stronger. Which again leads you to this idea of creating the cycle of saying, wow, this is an opportunity. And now all of a sudden, whether it be in combat or whether it be in a fight or whether it be as a professional football or baseball player, you start to seek out adversity in every day. You start doing it as a micro adversity, whether it be lifting weights, cold showers, Tabatas, difficult conversations, brutal honesty with yourself, or whether it be on a larger scale, which is what we're facing right now. I can't hear you, Jake. I think you're muted, buddy.
Now, thanks so much. Now I moved over to your scale. So let's talk about the second part of your model.
So what happens to all of us is we want to be the exception to the rule. We can be philosophical about somebody else's headache, but when it's our own, we don't want to be the person that's there. We want to be the exception to it. What these are ideas that you can actually put into play. And what I'm trying to do is make people step away from the hardship and see it objectively. So the adversity scale is another great example. If you look, as your lifespan goes on, There's 0 hardship, which a 0 on the scale would be like heaven on earth. And then 10 at the scale would be your hardest experience ever in your life. So for a lot of us, if we're very honest about the fact that somebody cuts us off in traffic or somebody's rude to us at the store, we can build it up into something really, really big if we allow our imagination to run away with it. But if we can step back and say, okay, on a piece of paper, on a grand scale of things, 10 is the worst thing I've ever been through and 0 is heaven on earth. Where does this really plot? And it makes us look at it and say, okay, in the grand scheme of things, that's maybe a 2. That person was rude to me. That person cut me off in traffic. Maybe. The good thing about the scale now is it actually scales to what we're doing today, which is for many people, this moment is the most difficult thing they've ever gone through. They're suffering mental instability because they're afraid, because they don't know where their next meal's coming from. They've lost their job. They're not sure about how they're going to provide for their family, etc. With adversity, the idea is, if this is the most difficult thing that you've gone through, this is your opportunity to evolve to the person who can overcome this and understand all of these things to put them into play to help you become empowered instead of feeling disempowered. Because the reality for all of us is this: emotions assassinate the truth. If we stay within that emotion, it's very difficult for us to continue to move forward and not be afraid and not be paralyzed by that ability to wait and hesitate. The idea is to give everybody a skill set that they can use right now, that they can put into play immediately. And that's why these principles are so important. If I give you a board that's about 5 or 6 inches wide and 20 feet long, and I put it on the ground and I say, walk this beam, most people can do it. But if I raise it up about 30 meters, it changes things. It doesn't change the board. It changes the outcome. It changes the potential outcome. It changes the stakes. And now there's no net beneath you, so to speak. So having these concepts and these abilities to reframe are important, but taking them up to the highest level is where it really becomes difficult. So they're simple, but they're not easy to apply. And that's why it's important to try to put these into play every single moment and affix this mentality to us before we get into the heat of it. Because once we're in it, we don't have the luxury of being philosophical about what we do next.
That's great, Marcus. I love it. And I love both these models. And honestly, everyone is experiencing it. What I love about adversity, right, is this idea that, as you'd mentioned, some people are experiencing it maybe for the first time as far as like the hardest thing that they have ever experienced in their lives. And there's some great work coming about in this field around like adverse childhood experiences, traumatic experiences you have as kids, right? And so some people may be also experiencing some of these adversities or parallels from what had happened in childhood to now, which kind of like throws into Tony's interesting work and kind of getting caught in emotion, right? And so, as we think about adversity and we think about car crashes and these very big things, we also think about other sort of points of scale, which I love so much, right? What is a 2? What is a 5? What's a 10? Because adversity can't be measured by one number, right? It's like a huge scale and how this all works and then how it all folds in. And so right now in this moment, people could be experiencing adversity in different levels, depending on their previous experience with adversity, whether they overcame it or not, or their own personal experiences. If you're someone that's in the healthcare field, right? Like you're experiencing it different than someone who just maybe needs to work from home, versus someone who has experiencing social isolation like many folks in our program right now. So I appreciate that, Marcus, and we'll get more into that later. I'd love to jump now into Tony, and we keep kind of holding Tony back, but I'm really excited because Marcus does his work tease up Tony so well. And so, Tony, you've done a lot around extensive work in psychology around fear since the 1980s. I would say if there's any word that people can relate to right now, it's probably fear. Can you start us off with why fear and why is it so important to understand fear?
Cool, man. So I'll do my best to compress decades of thoughts and ideas. As I said earlier, my discovery of the importance of fear was intuitive in studying violence, which I've continued to study for decades now, over 40 years. And I realized that fear throttles everything we do, from who you talk to, therefore who you marry, from where you live to, how much money you make, how much weight you lift, and whether or not you defend yourself. And that's like a thread through that. If I ask anybody, if I peel any onion, I go, well, why didn't you go further? Why didn't you do more? Why didn't you do that? they might package it without using the word fear. And this is a real irony that I haven't cracked the code on. People are afraid of the word fear. Consider that. Fear doesn't sell. You know, this whole no fear, like I get people are like, yeah, get that away from me. No, I don't have fear. There's a funny story that I tell often. I'll slip it in here. I was down at Fort Bragg, got in a couple of days early, meeting a couple of the operators from the unit I'm going to work with. And we're at a coffee shop, and one of the guys says to me, hey, I'm going to go jumping later. Do you want to come? And I say, like, jumping up and down? And he says, ha, 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 no skydiving. And I said, I'm good. No interest in jumping out of an airplane today. And he does air quotes. He goes, hey, like, aren't you like Mr. Fear Management? And I said, yeah, I'm managing my fear by not jumping out of the airplane. So he laughs. The guy beside him laughs too. But the guy who laughed beside him, I could tell it was a nervous laugh. And I knew instinctively that he didn't like skydiving, but I knew he was from the same unit, which means he had gotten good at it despite not liking it. Where am I going with this? I looked at the guy who had invited me, and I said, you know, I study fear. I interview athletes. I interview business people. I interview victims of violence. I interview warriors. And so just tell me, you have no fear when you go jumping? He goes, no, I love it. In fact, I go all the time. I have over 600 jumps. Anytime I got free time like today, I'm going. And I said, okay, no fear. He says, absolutely not. And I looked at him and I said, can I pack your chute for you today? And he leans back. He goes, you're not coming anywhere near my chute. And I said, did I just introduce some fear? And he's like, what? I said, if I changed your ritual, does that change your confidence? Like right now, you're not afraid, like you're shaking and shuddering, but you're like, I'm going to double check that. And so one of the things in our whole program is the idea of doubt creates hesitation. Hesitation creates fixation. Fixation unchecked becomes anxiety. And so this is extracted. I know I'm jumping all over the place and trying to cram as much magic dust in here as possible, but the idea is this. You can't be brave if you're not afraid, and we all want to be brave. I don't want to take skydiving lessons from an adrenaline junkie with a death wish. I want to take skydiving lessons from somebody who goes, you know, this is dangerous and I figured out how to do it properly. So there's things in life, whether, and these insights were actually born out of studying and practicing violence. I abhor violence, so I didn't want to ever be a victim, so I studied it. And the thing that I noticed, and I said earlier, regardless of gender, background, whatever, the people who managed their fear stayed in the fight. And I was trying to find a way that wasn't pedantic. I use that big word on purpose because nobody knows what it means. I didn't want it, like a lot of times when you go and you take some sort of therapy, it's pedantic and you're as lost, but you feel like I feel better that I talked to somebody. There's a psychologist that I coach who's actually specializes in working with vets dealing with PTSD. And he said, the cycle of behavior that we're going to share, he says that and some of my other models are more effective than anything he's ever learned in 20 years of psychology. And so I know this, that if you change your relationship with fear, you change your life, because some of us, and there's, you know, there's people here on this call that if you're a pro athlete, man, you're like, if you're playing football, like football's scary, but that same person who will, you know, like tackle somebody and risk life and limb, or a retired vet who would, you know, fast rope out of a helicopter and charge a threat with guys shooting at him, can't say I'm sorry, can't say I'm love you, can't, right? And so that vulnerability piece, what is that? That's fear. That's, and so what I've ended up creating initially just to help me selfishly, like I was like, why am I afraid of everything? But then as I became an accidental coach, where people started saying, hey, teach me, I would use them as guinea pigs. I'd go, hey, try this, think this, and they'd have amazing success. I remember one of my students got in like a real serious confrontation, and he handled it like a script out of a movie. It didn't get violent, but the way he navigated it and deflected and negotiated and de-escalated, I said, Peter, like, this is amazing. Like, I said, and I'm like, he's a private student of mine, right? This is back in the 80s. I go, like, what made you think to do all that? And he looked at me like I was nuts. He said, what are you talking about? You taught me all that. I didn't even understand the pieces. And you know, when JC said, hey, he did 6 deployments, but he wasn't really switched on or understood violence and what he had to think about until I trained him. I don't know what I did. That's the magic of this. I say things, I share things, and what you need to hear, the light goes on. And so it's not like follow this prescription and do this for 30 days. And if you order now, we'll send you some Ginsu knives. And, you know, it's not a scam. It's literally what I did is I was able to differentiate between what everyone talks about is the physiology and biology of fear, fight, flight, freeze. I looked at that stuff and as a young man, I went like, that's not important, is it? And people go, what do you mean? It's like everyone talks about fight or flight. But it's only something you identify from a forensics post-incident perspective. When you're in the battle, you're not going, I'm flighting, I'm fighting, I'm freezing. Like it's just happening. So we need to understand the psychology of fear, independent of whether our heart rate's going, whether we have tachypsyche, whether there's tunnel vision going on or auditory exclusion. So we need to create, and what I did is I created a simple script map of what the neural circuitry of fear looks like. And if you can look at that, you can identify where you are. And you look at it like, I am here, this is the kill zone, that's the fear loop. I need to get out of the kill zone. And if I start moving, I will move towards safety. And and it's literally that simple. So that what it does is it enhances self-awareness, which gives you the opportunity to access your critical thinking skills. Because when you're freaking out, it's emotional and your executive function is being compromised. So the little map, so there's a big difference between like if all of us got dropped into the jungle or forest, the people who really thought they were lost panic and walk around in circles, get eaten by stuff, eat poisonous stuff, sit down and just give up. So there's a difference between being lost and not where you want to be. And so the map can say, wow, I'm really stressed about this. I'm not where I want to be. How do I get there? And it's just one foot after another. So it's an interesting thing. And I don't want to eat up too much time, but I remember in the 80s, I had a private student. I didn't know what he was doing. His name was, I knew his name was Dr. Presser, but I didn't know what he was a doctor of. And he worked at a very famous, I used to live in Montreal, Canada, a US citizen now living out in California. And Dr. Presser worked at the famous Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. And he was part of the psychiatry board. And one day after taking lessons with me, he said, your approach to managing fear is very interesting. Would you come to speak to some of my colleagues? And like everybody trying to get successful, you know, you never say no. So I said, yeah. And I went and, you know, like I said to him, I said, who am I talking to? He said, a bunch of my colleagues, we're at the hospital. So I'm like, the hospital, you guys doctors? Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go talk to doctors. Well, when I get there and I find that it's like everyone had a PhD in psychology, psychiatry, and I intuitively made this stuff up. I didn't go to school. I interviewed victims of violence. I put it together watching people not performing the way they thought they were going to be. So I go in there and I was glad I was wearing a black polo at the time because I was scared shitless. And, you know, number one fear for most people is public speaking. So here I am, I'm like 27 years old. I'm public speaking to a bunch of PhDs, 12 in this like U-shaped desk, and I'm standing there and I talked for 90 minutes and they all have legal pads in front of them and they're holding pens and nobody writes a single thing down for the 90 minutes. And I'm thinking to myself, I must really suck. Like they haven't even wrote, not even like a head turning, a note, like a big X, nothing. And I'm in the fear loop while I'm talking. And at the end of it, the head, who wasn't my student, the head guy sitting at the end, he looks at me and he goes like this. He taps his pen on his legal pad. He does this on his face, puts it in his mouth. He goes, where did you get this stuff? And I knew, holy shit, I'm onto something. Like there were 12 people who study, and I looked at him, I'm a bit of a smart ass. JC can attest to that. I've mellowed a lot in as I got older. But when he said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "Well, while you were memorizing from, Jung and Freud, I was actually talking to people who are really scared, victims of violence, and when that happened, I went so deep in this because it was almost like confirmation. It was like anti-confirmation, right? Because I wasn't following a pattern, but I knew, and that was like 30 something years ago. So here we are today.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. By the way, while you were speaking, I was writing notes, but not because,
right.
I would,
Big X's.
Yeah, actual, just like, yeah, the X's, everything you say. But I love this idea because you and Marcus have brought up about, self-awareness, right? Like once we understand some of these methods and what's going on in the body and the brain, that we really think about like, how do I get to that level of self-awareness? And then, most importantly, that the methods that we're talking about today are not a one size fits all, right? Like that, we introduce these broad concepts and there's not specific practices in place because everyone is going to be different. And mental health is like, we talk about physical activity, right? And that being like something that's prescribed, but mental health is really challenging because everyone has such a different experience in life. And the third point I love, Tony, is the lived experience, right? This idea of like interviewing the people who have gone through these challenges to garner like a little bit more research and insight into how you develop your methods, which, any academic person could say that maybe they have a little bit less experience in some of that stuff because they are a little bit more bound to the books. So I love all these concepts. And with that, I really want to talk a little bit more about your model, the cycle of behavior. You and I talked previously that academics can sometimes get lock and key on psychology, right? This idea that there's these really huge concepts and words and things that people don't really understand. And for a really long time in this field, it's been under lock and key to only the professionals, because people really didn't know how to boil it down to someone that's average, like all these people on the phone right now. And so I love this idea that you took that, you saw it as an opportunity to say, hey, instead of making these like high level things, we really need to bring it down to this level where people can understand, because it's so important to gain self-awareness. And, you want to remove all the barriers to understanding terminology and stuff and make it applicable to people's lived experiences and lived lives that you just mentioned. So can you go a little bit into your cycle of behavior, how you develop the model, a little bit of that. And I'm also going to share on the screen what Tony's developed.
Cool. Which version are we doing? The last one, the first one? Well, all the lines, let's see it.
We're going to do the black one.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so really fun origin story on that. And do you have the other one too as well that we can put up after?
Yep, I can definitely do that.
Yeah, we can keep that one up there now. That's great. So if you look at the top is the scenario. Everything I talk about is what's the scenario, because the scenario dictates everything. The two next boxes, motivation, expectation. In I think it was around 1986, 87, I was listening to an interview with Howard Gardner, who's a famous social scientist. And in this interview, Gardner said, and I'm driving, and he says that his research over years to thousands of subjects, that he believes that 80% of our motivation is derived from our expectation. And as soon as he said that, I knew it was important. And I actually said to the radio, because I was driving, I went, what? Because I was like, you're kind of like listening and driving. And he repeats it again as if he answered me, which kind of was like freaky, right? So like I'm driving, he goes, 80% of motivations derived from expectations. And I was like, whoa, what was that? He says, 80% of our motivations. I went back to my office. This is in the 80s. There's no whiteboards. I had, I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember blotters on your desk. And I wrote down, and literally within a half an hour, I wrote almost exactly this flow chart. There's a few new things in here, but what I did is I wrote down that our motivation and our expectations, when we're faced with something, if I say, okay, guys, we've got this shelter in place thing coming down. Initially, we're like, okay, that'll be cool. Time to read, time to clean, time to catch up, right? And then like 3 days later, you're like, what's going on, right? And so what starts to happen is we start to perpetuate and trigger this fear loop. It could be, hey, for my military guys, guys, we got some bad guys. We're anticipating this. We're going to go here. When we're planning stuff, right, we're motivated. We've got positive expectations. But what starts to happen, and I introduced this in our new chart, a sudden stimulus gets introduced. And it's a stimulus that derails us from this perfect plan, right? And that's when we get the fear spike. Now, remember the example I gave you with the skydiver. There are some athletes, they're outliers, and there are some warriors, they're outliers, that don't relate to danger and fear the way the rest of us do. So they're the outlier, and it's not about being average or above average or below average. It's just understanding that anything that derails you from your tactical imperative triggers a fear spike. And that fear spike can be triggered by what I call a neuroassociation, how our brain links up a symbol, right? And the neuroassociation could be bad news. It could be a tweet. It could be a shitty phone call. It could be a pre-contact cue that you amplify in your mind, right? Oh shit, I'm like, oh look, I'm gonna get nailed here. Most of the people that I've worked with who've been in law enforcement, military, who've been in death matches, admit that they were in the throes of that fight. They thought this was it. This is where they're gonna die. They're done here. And they're kind of making peace with that. And then this thought happens of, you know what? I don't want to die right now. And that's this shift of managing fear. That's what we call the challenge or threatened door. This is really an expanded chart. So we've got multiple ones depending on how I'm working with people, whether, you know, it's a one-on-one or a company or a group. So this is almost like the final, most robust one. It's a little overwhelming, but each one of these blocks, if you visualize this as an electrical circuit board, and each one of those blocks is a fuse. The metaphor here in the neural circuitry of fear is if I stay too long anywhere, I overload that circuit and I blow a fuse. If I blow a fuse, I disempower myself. So the idea here, if I run through it, is everything's hunky-dory. I'm cool with the lockdown, or I'm cool with, like, I'm loading my weapons, I'm getting ready to go. And then I get an idea and I break down. I use two acronyms that I love, jumping down to the bottom right corner: false evidence appearing real and false expectations appearing real. False evidence is I see something and it triggers a negative image or negative story in my mind that starts the negative expectation, the movie in my mind. All of us have wasted time sitting in a chair, lying in a bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. You know, think about a time you're like holding your phone, waiting for someone to text you back. And then like a half an hour goes by and you played out every negative scenario for why that text isn't coming in. I guess I'm getting fired. I guess she doesn't love me. I guess I'm not important. I guess, and you go through this. And I tell people, like, that movie, you're the screenwriter, you're the producer, you're the director, and you're the star. And the movie's a horror movie that you're creating, and you've decided to cast yourself as victim number one. What we're trying to cultivate with this map, and I want you all to think about this map, and it's online, we can email it to you, is you look at this map holographically. Like anything in life, you're standing there. If you pause for a moment because you got a fear spike, neuroassociation because I saw something, I visualized something. I want you to understand that the fear spike creates doubt, hesitation, fixation, and possibly some anxiety state. These are because of limiting beliefs. This ties directly into what Marcus was talking about reframing adversity, right? And so this is, you know, one of the reasons why I want to do some work with him, is because I can embrace his adversity model, but the fear spike is emotional. The adversity model is cognitive, it's executive function. It's like, I'm going to think this way. The obstacle is the way. I'm going to be stoic. I'm going to study this. I'm going to meditate. And suddenly you get a fear spike. I mean, I've had some trauma. A couple of years ago, I had a neck injury that damaged my facial nerve that started triggering anxiety in me because of pressure on the vagus nerve. I'd be in a good mood. Next thing I know, boom, panic attacks would start to happen. And I was so confused because I've never had that. I would say, okay, I'm going to go from my sympathetic to my parasympathetic and do the breathing, and actually turning on an app to listen to it created more anxiety. Right? So it couldn't stay cognitive. I had to get control. I had to understand where I was. And so ironically and serendipitously, I was able to lean on this and go, you're in the fear loop, man. You got to get out of the fear loop. And sometimes it was push-ups. Sometimes we'd go for a run. Sometimes we'd go hit a bag. Sometimes we'd go for a walk. But the most important thing you can take from this is the red is the kill zone. The red is the place where for the athletes, you can't make the catch. You're going to get dropped. You know, you're a tennis player. It's no man's land. The red zone's the kill zone. How do we get out of that? And again, without, you know, it takes some investment and some time to go through the whole thing. But our goal is to get out of the fear loop. Now, the yellow, if you look at the bottom left legend, green is go, yellow is slow. It's what we call the discomfort zone or the duress path. And red is no go. When you're in the fear loop, you're frozen with fear. You're not doing stuff. You're like Jim Carrey and Dumb and Dumber, sitting in the bathroom with your thumb in your mouth, right? We want to go to, at a minimum, we need to get to the challenge or threatened door. And the way we do that is just asking ourselves a line that I love from Man on Fire with Denzel Washington, where, you know, he's in the pool training the kid to swim. And he says, are you trained or untrained? And she says, trained, and everything goes. And I always get goosebumps when I talk about that, because everyone on this call is trained. The difference between freezing and choking is a person who has no skill set freezes because they don't know what to do. Somebody who knows what to do chokes. Why do we choke? We choke because we're in the fear loop, because we're fixating on fear. We're fixating on, and it's simple as this. The movie in your mind is false expectation appearing real. I am the star. I'm victim number one in this horror film that I'm creating because, and this is how I define the acronym of false expectations appearing real. It's when I'm visualizing a future event. It's when I'm visualizing a future event that involves my doom, my destruction, my pain, my agony, but it hasn't even happened. It's just in my mind, but it's immobilizing me right now in the present. So it's when I'm visualizing something in the future that's debilitating me in the present. The only way to step out of that movie is to embrace that metaphor and go, wait a minute. I wrote this movie. I'm making this movie happen. I can therefore walk out. I can go out and go, I want my money back. I can step out of the movie. I can also pretend like I'm using my phone as if it's a remote. I can change the channel. Everyone on this call, I mean, like this morning, my wife told me something. It was bad. It wasn't good news. As soon as she said that, my brain started to complete if then go to, like an old DOS program. If this happens and this happens, the domino effect. But guys, listen, self-awareness said, dude, you're starting the movie. I'm going to animate what I did. Whoa, stop that. Don't want to think that. Got to think positive. Got to stay focused. At a minimum, I got to get out of the fear loop. I changed that. Now, the duress path is if I'm still worrying about shit while I'm doing it. So I still need to have a goal. I still need to have a plan. I still need to rethink, review the plan, and I still need to make it happen. Can you quickly shift to the next slide?
Yeah.
So I want you to think about, this is the way most people go through life.
Tell me if that's the right
one. Go to
one.
the other one. The other, there were two black ones, black background.
I've got the two white ones, Tony.
Oh, okay. So go back to the other one.
Yeah.
There's another one that you guys are going to have to Google and get. So there's another one here where the green line is embedded there. And the green line actually flows parallel to the gold or yellow line. And that's our hypothetical flow state that everyone talks about, right? So those of you who have been in battle, there's that moment where like you're just in the zone. You're not thinking about stuff. You can't hear shots. You don't hear anything. You're like, there's these nano moments. There are those of you who've made that amazing winning, play, the catch. You're in the zone and it's that super, super high, holy shit. And that's where we all want to be. But the reality, if we're being transparent, is that a lot of times we get fear spikes. Hope I don't screw this up. Hope I don't drop the ball. A lot of times we're worrying about the future. We're worrying about the past, and we're carrying the weight with us. That's the duress path. And so just visualize that there's a green line that runs parallel to that. But the whole message on the fear loop here is this, and the biggest and the simplest piece of advice that I can give everybody is save a copy of this and think of it holographically and organically. You're walking through your day, and then all of a sudden someone says, did you hear this? What do you think of this? Did you check the news? By the way, and that's a sudden stimulus that you don't like. It's natural to get a fear spike. And as soon as you get a fear spike, your brain starts to go, well, this must mean this. And then the visual starts. And what you notice is you're not proactive at that moment. Doubt and hesitation starts to happen. You need to, at that point, if you have the opportunity, if it's not a violent encounter, you have the opportunity to stop it by doing some sort of intelligent breathing practice, some meditation, confer with somebody. In other words, you've got to grab the fear loop right there and go, self-awareness says, I'm in a fear loop. I've got to get out of it. What do I need to do? And so that's, I mean, we can talk for hours on this because the workshop is a lot longer than that. But it's literally, it's this simple, guys. It's, and gals, you know, I'm just using that as a colloquialism. When you identify you're in the fear loop, you realize I am now being emotional and my decisions are going to be emotional and therefore reactive. How do I get cognitive? How do I get back into executive function? And a lot of people think, well, great. So how do I get out of the fear loop? And they think that if you look at my shirt now, they think this exists, that no fear exists, but it doesn't. It's, I got to get to no fear. I got to change my relationship with fear. And there's lots of things in life we need to do scared. And if we can do them carrying the weight of fear, this speaks to and ties into, that's the gift of adversity. Because when we come out the other side of that, we are better, we are stronger. It's that pressure. You don't build strength like lifting light weights, right? So anyways, I'm rambling.
I love it, Tony. Thanks so much. And I think that model is so important for us to understand, especially as we all go through this experience, the shared experience of COVID-19. And so I will mention to the people that are on that we'll go over about 5-10 minutes just so we can take some questions. If you do have questions, please, you can either tweet it at vetsandplayers.org, or you can just put it in the chat box and AJ will, our marketing guy, will pull it for the end. So I want to move over to JC. So obviously JC just joined us as National Director for MVP. And what I love about JC is he has extensive knowledge on leadership through his books, his TED Talk X, and some other work as well. And so we're all, JC, we're seeing all kinds of leadership in this crisis right now being displayed. And so it's so relevant to bring you on to talk about leadership. But first and foremost, what led you to wanting to understand leadership methodology, all the things that you've written about?
So, and this all really fits in very nicely. So my whole life has been, I've been fortunate to lead. I have almost 10 years of command of leadership time, direct leadership time in the military. And most of that was in combat. And I realized very quickly that I had probably been leading the wrong way in the pre-war leadership model that I'd grown up with as a cadet, as a young lieutenant. Even though I had amazing leaders, I was probably not looking at it the right way. And I realized that once I got to combat, and I realized that quite honestly, I was leading to control and action as opposed to what leaders truly do. And so I wanted, the truth is, if you're leading to control and action, you're managing. And unfortunately, you manage things, right? You manage resources, you manage time, you manage money, but you don't manage people. You have to lead people. And so that got me kind of to think about, okay, so how do we lead in what arguably, and I do think it's arguable, but to be the most complex of situations, and that's combat, especially when you want to empower subordinate leaders to execute, to do the right thing for the right reason. You want them to be disciplined as opposed to obedient, right? Doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time, regardless of the consequence, which is different than obedience, which is do what you're told to do. And I think most people looked at the military and thought, oh, well, they want obedience. Well, obedience does not work well in combat, and it certainly doesn't work well in decentralized combat. So I became a student of how do you lead effectively, and how do you lead at all levels, so that the most important thing is the people. And so what I'll share with you is kind of my model, which fits very nicely into both what Tony and Marcus have said. So as I said, if I talk to leaders and I say, what are you leading for? They usually say the end state, right? The bottom line. Hey, I have to make numbers this quarter. Hey, I'm leading for the win. I'm leading to get X accomplished, right? So it's the action. And when I started to look at it, and again, based on some pretty smart guys, if I looked at when people didn't accomplish an action, they didn't do something, there was only one reason they didn't do it. If you all think of the times when you've wanted to do something, but you didn't do it. You wanted to ask out that person, but you didn't follow through. You wanted to try for this new job, but you didn't do it. The one thing that was holding you back, in my mind, was fear. Fear stopped the action. And so now as a leader, I go, okay, so maybe I don't worry about the action. Maybe now I worry about fear. Okay, well, fear is Tony is able to put it in very clear terms, but fear is different for everybody. And here's the other thing that I believe about fear is it's a constant. It's always there. It's always part of the equation. It's always in the back of your mind. As Tony once said, if somebody's not afraid, they're either crazy or they're stupid. So fear is there. It's always in the back of our head somewhere when there's things that we're doing. And so now, if I'm looking at the fear and it's a constant, what I need to do is I need to create something greater than fear in that constant, because if it's always there, okay, so now I need to create something, because good leaders never destroy anything. They only create something better. So notice I'm not saying destroy fear. I don't think you can do that. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to think about something, let's build something better than fear. And I believe that now you have to create courage. Now, this is really cool because look, we've gone from the action and we've gone 2 steps up now as a leader. I'm not worried about the action now. Now I'm worrying about creating courage in my people. So this again, how do you create courage in the constant of fear? Well, I'll start with saying, there's 2 ways to lead people in very generic terms. You can motivate them or you can inspire them. Motivation and inspiration are very, very different in my mind. And the biggest difference is I don't believe you can inspire in a negative way. You can motivate in a negative way. If you don't do this, you're fired. If you don't do this, you're cut. If you do this, these people will die. That is motivation, and that is negative. That's the simplest way I can put it. And if you look at the Latin root of motive, it's to move, to physically move. But inspiration, inspire in Latin, is to breathe fire into, to breathe breath into. That's amazing, right? So now you say, okay, so I need to do something that, if I motivate, I can conceivably just cause more fear. I need to inspire. I believe that you inspire in 2 ways. You create hope and trust. Hope, what I'm asking you to do is worth doing, and you can do it. And trust, hey, I'm going to be there with you. I'm going to resource you. I'm going to do the things you need to do. If you reverse engineer this and you look at some of the people that are considered inspirational leaders throughout history, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy. Let's just take Kennedy for an example. Kennedy says to the nation, we're going to go to the moon. when 63 years prior, the Wright brothers flew a Kitty Hawk. That's amazing. 63 years, and he goes, yep, we're going to the moon. And everybody goes, yeah, we're going to the moon. He inspired them. He created hope. He told people, this is something good. This is worth doing, and we can do it. And I'm going to resource you. I'm going to be behind you. I'm going to support you, and we're going to do this together. That, when it all comes down to it, what leaders truly do is they lead by creating courage in their people. They lead because they create something better than the fear. So great leaders, they don't motivate, they inspire. And when you're inspiring, you're trying to negate the fear by creating something better. Stop sharing here. Okay.
I love that, JC. And that's such a perfect framing, especially because, as Marcus talks about adversity and overcoming adversity, Tony talks about being caught in the fear loop. And we're all, a lot of leaders may or may not be very self-aware that they're potentially even caught in fear and stimulus right now. And so I think more than ever, we're looking for leaders in our communities, whether it's, inside MVP in our own program, outside on the staff side, or even just people that are, leading the way during this crisis. And so it's so good to see the framing of these two things together in your model around leadership. And so, because we don't have very much time, and I do want to leave a few minutes for questions, I do want to sort of package this all together. And Tony, Marcus, and JC, thanks so much for joining us. But, most importantly, this isn't, like a single event. It's not like 9/11. We wake up, this thing happens, and then we all grieve as a nation over several weeks, right? It's and Tony's not going to like this because it's a very psychology term, right? But it's like complex trauma, right? It's something that happens over and over. And it's like we wake up every morning and it's another car crash. It's another car crash. And maybe not to that extreme, like Marcus talked about in adversity, everyone has a different scale in that, but the stimulus is constantly being activated. And it feels like we're drinking from a fear fire hose maybe right now. And that's every single day. And so, these things have longer term impacts in our communities, whether it's inside MVP or outside. And so these methods that Marcus and Tony and JC have brought are so important to frame as we try to get to the level of self-awareness, knowing that right now is a really hard time, harder than most, harder than not having a pandemic floating over you, that understanding where your self-awareness is in these methods are so important, because we need to develop a practice. And practice looks like the stuff that JC, Tony, and Marcus have talked about, right? Taking these elements that most apply to you, because first and foremost, these methods aren't just like a one size fits all. It is developed in a way that you guys can take these concepts and apply them in different ways to your own lives. So without jumping into a lot of the COVID-19 stuff that we want to talk about, we'll save that for another time. I do want to jump into some Q&A, and so I'll share my screen and see if anyone has any Q&As. Great. So we'll start with Angela. So when I get trapped in the fear cycle, self-awareness disappears because my brain has literally been hijacked by stress hormones, the amygdala and survival response. There's no chance for rationality. Do you have any tips for calming this down? So I'll give it to Marcus, Tony, or JC.
Tony, I think this is yours.
Yeah, well, damn it. JC, I'm going to give it to you. No, Angela, listen, can I see her? I can look at the chat too, right? To reread that. Yeah. When I get trapped, if you reread what you wrote, look at your second to last line. There's no chance for rationality. Why not? So if you've got the self-awareness, this is, I don't know what your background is, so I'll try to give just a generic example. The idea here is in like anything in life, I call this the 3Ds: detect, diffuse, defend. And most people think of that as external. Detect, I see stuff; diffuse, hey, calm down; defend, I gotta push away danger. When I'm doing stuff that's more therapeutic, that's more coaching, that's more internal, the 3Ds need to be internal. Your goal is to detect what are the pre-contact cues that put you here, because your question starts after the attack. I'm already in the fear loop and now there's no chance. So the homework is to anticipate it and memorize, get the chart. Doubt becomes hesitation. Hesitation becomes fixation. Fixation is that anxiety. Once you're in the fixation anxiety phase, that starts to happen. You can still extract yourself out. You can still pull yourself out there. But what you're trying to do is really cultivate that self-awareness. The biggest thing that I'll tell you is if you just say to yourself and accept where you are, I'm in the fear loop, I'm now going to move. So if your habit was lie in bed, sit in a chair, just look at one thing on your phone. That's what a lot of people do when they get stuck. And you've got to move that there. So, I'm not a therapist. I'm just telling you that this stuff works. You got to stop the movie in your mind. And if I were rewriting this, it's, sometimes I find myself trapped in the fear cycle, and my self-awareness disappears because my brain literally has been hijacked by stress, blah, blah. I get all that. What I need to do to reclaim control is I need to intercept this earlier. I need to catch it earlier. I need to change it before it gets here. Now, again, without, look, I'm being careful what I'm saying, so I'm editing myself here. If you're not doing deliberate breathing practice, that's part of it. If you don't have a simple meditation practice, that's part of it. If you're in a fear loop that's not caused by like an active shooter and you're hiding in a closet, you have time to go, wow, okay, I just thought about this. And I could see it, like, without getting personal, something happened. I mentioned my wife earlier. She said, hey, I think this. And it was like, stop the movie there. This can be a short film. Don't turn it into a documentary, right? I got to go do a podcast. But I know that if she sits in the bed and overthinks this personal situation, she will put herself into that anxiety state, possibly a panic attack. It's really that simple. And I've had people say to me, because of their years of dealing with this, is it really that simple to stop it so that I don't have the anxiety? And I answer, why not? Somebody else will tell you it isn't, but why not? The big shift is, it doesn't mean your fear has gone away and the stress has gone away. It just means you need to move and reframe that. And it's baby steps. It's little steps at a time.
If I could jump in also on something, Angela, that has helped me technique wise. People talk about unconscious bias, and unconscious bias, it's a negative thing. It's a negative thing. It's a negative thing. It's not a negative thing. It's kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years. It's our limbic system saying, look out, watch out. Now, it's a bad thing if we take that response from our limbic system and go, yes, that's bad, no matter what. That I just listen to my limbic system. But there's this really cool exercise where you can say, okay, I'm afraid. Is this something to be afraid of? And you take that initial reaction, that initial response, because here's what your brain's always doing. Your brain is always 100% of the time looking for threats. It's trying to keep you alive. That's why it shortcuts everything. It wants, when you were first learning how to drive, you were like, okay, 10 and 2 and this mirror, right? And then your brain started to create shortcuts because it doesn't want to do stuff in sequence. It wants to do it the easiest, fastest way possible so it can keep looking for danger. So if you know that about your brain and you go, okay, here's what I'm going to do. The minute I get that initial fear spike, as Tony calls it, I'm going to push it, especially in, again, unless it's an active shooter situation or you're in an immediate fight, you're going to see something and that fear spike. And then you've got to bring it to the prefrontal cortex where all your complex decision-making happens. And I literally think about when I get that feeling, and I can tell you, like personally, I get like this weird feeling in the back of my teeth when my fear spike goes up. And when I'm there, I go, okay, bring it to the front. And I think about like taking a little box and walking it to the front of my brain. It's pretty empty in there, so there's plenty of room. And being able to say, okay, now it's here. Is this really something to be afraid of? And that little technique of that visualization. Now, do I do that you know, there's other things, and Tony can go, he can give you a ton of things that you can do when that fear spike is there, kind of when you're, you know, in an immediate kind of crisis situation. And a lot of it has to do with thinking, you know, ahead, so that you understand the situation and you have branches and sequels. But I think that most of the things that I come in contact with today are not immediate, oh my gosh, you know, it's not the driving on the road, it's the, oh my gosh, did I pay that bill, right? Oh, am I gonna have money in my account? You know, am I gonna stay? Those are the things that you go, wait a second, is that really something I need to be afraid of? So I think that helps as well.
Yeah, thanks, JC, so much. And I think Tony says it so perfectly framed for Angela too, right? Like this like recognition of self-awareness that you're in the fear loop. And I think back to what JC said about unconscious bias, right? We've been trained to not feel anything, right? Like, oh, you're angry, don't get angry. Like, oh, you're upset, don't get upset. And so like techniques are like recognize that it's okay to feel that way. And I could do a whole thing about like how these feelings live in the body, right? So we've had conversations inside MVP about, you know, certain tics that people develop when they do get anxious or fearful, right? Whether it's like the sweats in your body, or so your voice changes up and down, or things like that. And when you start understanding where you are in your body and living in that, you can kind of get more recognition towards understanding what Tony's talking about, which is being caught in a fearful state and how do you pull yourself out of that. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining the panel. I really do want to thank Tony, Marcus, and JC for all of your time today on our panel, Encourage Hope Through Adversity. And we'll have some follow-up on Marcus and Tony's work here in a few minutes. And as I've mentioned before, we're going to be hosting a series of these panels throughout this month, leading up to Mental Health Awareness Month. And so just look out on our newsletter, on our social media, and other places where you may find us. And I will put this up really quick for our last catch here, which is just a follow-up and a thank you to everyone. So Tony, Marcus, and JC, thanks again so much for your time. We really, really appreciate you. I know our community learned a lot. I learned a lot. And we thank you so much, especially during this time in which fear is very challenging, but offers an opportunity for us to all be leaders in this moment.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Jacob. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Marcus, Tony, and JC. Thanks, everyone who joined us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fabulous.
Thank you for putting this on, everyone.